We are about ready to jump into our fifth session. That session is at your service, getting set up to quickly deliver actionable information with your usage data. This is going to be presented by David Macaulay, who is an electronic resources librarian at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. David, if you're ready, you can start sharing your screen.
Okay, can people see my first slide?
Yes, looks good.
All right, well, I'll get started then. Thanks for the intro and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining me for this presentation of practical tips on getting set up to responsively deliver actionable information with your electronic resources usage data. Before we start, I'll acknowledge that the University of Nebraska, where I work and I am presently sitting, has campuses and programs across the state of Nebraska that reside on the past, present, and future homelands of the Pawnee, Ponca, Oto-Missouri, Omaha, Dakota, Lakota, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Kaw peoples, as well as the relocated Ho-Chunk or Winnebago, Iowa, and Sac and Fox people. So when you're an electronic resources librarian like myself, a significant portion of your working life is probably focused on dealing with data about usage of online resources. While usage data obviously can't be considered as the only indicator of the value of e-resources to a library's user community, there's no doubt it is extremely useful and perhaps even fundamental in helping to understand how users interact with them. So we place a lot of emphasis on being able to collect, manage, and report on this data. The electronic resources in a library's collection can comprise a wide variety of resources that are made available by different online providers and are used in varying ways by patrons. The types of questions that people want to ask of the associated usage data can also vary widely. So I've listed here just a few typical questions that might come up in an academic library. Now, it'd be obviously be ideal to have data ready and accessible to help answer these questions without unnecessary delay using whatever reporting and analysis tools you might have at your disposal. But at the academic libraries where I've worked over the years, I found when starting out that more or less reactive approaches to dealing with usage reports were in place. And these were slowing down responses to queries and sometimes compromising the value of the information that was provided. At my current institution, for example, I noticed that when a question came up about the value of a specific resource that was up for renewal, someone might email the vendor's account rep and just ask them to supply the usage reports. Those could take a while to obtain, and then when we got them, they might not end up not providing or even obscuring the information we wanted. At the same time, other staff in the library were largely focused on compiling fiscal year data to respond to annual statistical surveys, but they were often working with partial or outdated information about what the library was subscribing to. So in both cases, the relevant data might already have been collected and stored somewhere, but not in a way that made it accessible and usable for multiple purposes. To be fair, there were well-intentioned efforts to take a systematic approach to report gathering, but these were more or less foundering due to inconsistent attention to the care and feeding of the process. For example, records of a resource administrator account logins didn't always get updated. Changes to subscriptions weren't reflected in the reports that were collected. Report collection schedules were irregular, documentation was spotty, and there was just not much ongoing attention to the range of data needs in the organization. So my session today will cover some of the basic principles of a proactive approach to collecting and managing usage reports for your library, one that can lay the groundwork for creating a usage report archive that supports timely response to a range of queries about e-resource usage. So this is really intended for an audience that is not extremely experienced with e-resource usage data management. So anybody attending who is very knowledgeable on this subject might get impatient pretty quickly. But on the other hand, they may want to stick around if they have additional or maybe superior tips to share afterwards in the Q&A. Further, I'm be concerned here mainly with the general considerations involved in setting up a usage data program and not with practical specifics or with particular tools or products that may be available to help you in this area, though I'll be making reference to systems that I've worked with personally. So I won't be providing a detailed recipe for you to follow, but rather pointing out a few areas that you will benefit from paying attention to. Basic but important stuff. So first, just a few words to define the type of usage data I'm talking about here. There are a variety of sources of information about usage of online resources that might be available to your library. When it comes to system-generated quantitative data, there are two main types. You can have reports that are generated by the resource provider, which shows activity on their servers that is identified as coming from the library's user community, typically based on IP address or single sign-on authentication. Or you could have data collected by various systems in the library, showing, for example, clicks on links in catalog records or A to Z list entries, calls to your link resolver, or connections via authentication systems such as your proxy server or single sign-on services like OpenAtlas, for example. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on the vendor provider reports, since they generally provide the most complete record of user engagement with online resources. When a vendor doesn't provide usage reports at all or can't provide some desired information, such as whether a user is a faculty member or student, for example, then reporting from other library systems might be able to fill in some of those useful details. So step one in the proactive approach I'm discussing will involve figuring out what you need to report about. In other words, what e-resources do you have and where do users connect to them? In my experience, the method that's been the most efficient is to begin by identifying all the resource platforms or websites, in other words, where your library is accessing content. And these will typically correspond to your sources of usage reports. Many libraries use knowledge-based systems to track their e-resources, so that's an excellent place to begin since these are normally organized by provider and or platform. For example, my institution is currently using Ex Libris Alma, so the most obvious starting point there would be to generate a list of our activated electronic collections and then focus on the distinct interface names, as they're called, which generally correspond to platforms that will generate reports. Bullet 2 on the slide here shows an example of some e-resources and their association with platforms or interfaces in an Alma report. Now, if you don't have documentation of resource provenance in the form of a knowledge base, you might start to identify distinct platforms simply by looking at a list of all the links to e-resources that you provide to users and extracting a unique base domain from the URLs. This approach would also apply to sort of single journal activations in a knowledge base. And if you provide access via an A to Z list to databases that aren't in the knowledge base listing, this approach will also help fill in the gaps. Bullet 3 on this slide shows an example of how various resources on an A to Z list can be grouped by the domain name in their URLs. In this case, alexanderstreet.com. Step 2 involves identifying and documenting the information you need to access the usage reports for your providers. Once you have a list of the providers, you can assemble that information that you need to get to their usage reports. Access methods for usage data might include administrator logins that provide access to online usage reporting facilities, a separate usage reporting login, or requests may have to be sent by email or web form to get those reports back. Normally, the step I'm talking about will involve collecting any existing records about admin logins or other contact points for report collection, then checking they're up to date and working, and then filling in the gaps by reaching out to providers to obtain new ones. If you have a system that supports automated collection of standard reports using Sushi, for example, you can usually get the required connection credentials via your admin login. So while going through your existing administrator logins, it might make sense to assess how they've been set up in the past. Then you can make any desired changes to smooth the process of resource administration in general. For example, at my institution, many of the admin accounts were set up using personal email addresses of people who had later stopped working with usage reports, and also a number of obsolete shared mailbox addresses were sometimes used, and this made it difficult to confirm configuration changes or reset passwords. So this login review step was a good opportunity to update our admin account details to use a valid shared email address. Once the logins were set up and recorded, you can make sure that the URLs and credentials are stored where they're easily accessible to personnel working with usage reports. In Alma, for example, we have vendor records where we can store this information, and the access to these is controlled by system role-based permissions. If you're using a sushi client, the relevant connection information will be recorded directly in the configurations for the various providers, and you can normally verify these on the usage reporting site of the provider. So while the majority of your usage reports will likely be available directly on a self-serve basis via these logins, there are many providers who will only generate reports on request, and this ends up being probably the most labor-intensive aspect of usage data collection. Generally, an account rep or perhaps a support desk will take whatever steps are required to generate the usage numbers you request and then send them along in an email. In reality, the contact point at the provider could change at any time from year to year, along with the type of information that they supply, depending on how they understand the term usage report. So when you start receiving reports, you'll need to verify that they contain the information that you want and be ready to go back to explain what you're looking for if they don't. We found attaching a previous report as an example. It's a simple way to do this. And it's also worthwhile to recycle previous emails to a provider when requesting new reports to save time and promote consistency. And finally, for each provider, you'll have to document completely the method of accessing the reports. And to state the obvious, make sure that the documentation is updated whenever a change is made. The documentation should include any special pathways for logging in or accessing usage reporting on the provider's site, because sometimes this is not completely straightforward. This documentation will be a big help to others who are tasked with collecting or troubleshooting usage reports in the future. The next step in this plan would involve determining the type of data that you need to get from the reports. So as most of you probably know, there's a well-established standard for electronic resource usage data called Counter Code of Practice. While the majority of larger academic publishers have now implemented usage reporting that complies with Release 5 of Counter, which became effective in 2019, you'll likely find that a number of providers have not done this. Instead, they may supply non-standard reports in any number of formats, or they may supply reports that comply with Counter Release 4 or even earlier, and these will be significantly different from Release 5, but may still be compatible in specific respects. Or they may supply Counter-like reports that differ from the standard format in significant ways, but will need to be manipulated to come into line with the standard. So while it will be up to the individual library to determine what data is useful to collect, the benefits of focusing on reports that comply with the current standard is fairly obvious. Having the same type of data for a range of different resources makes it much simpler to compare usage across the collection and to evaluate it using consistent methods. It also makes for much greater ease of data management and analysis using tools that have been developed specifically to deal with the standard reports. For this reason, when I communicate about usage reports with publishers who don't use the standard, I always make a point of recommending that they implement Counter. Providers of Counter-compliant reports will usually offer the full range that covers the usage of the platform, database, title, and possibly article or item level. You'll need to determine which reports provide the metrics you need for the resources in your collection, and this could require some experimentation. For example, the breakdown of usage of specific databases may be included on platform reports or on database reports, depending on the publisher. And just some details about Release 5 of the Counter standard. It provides for a set of comprehensive base reports covering platform, database, title, and item usage. And then it has a range of more restricted reports that represent subsets or views of that base report information. So for example, while the main TR title report contains complete information about usage of different content types at the title level, TRJ1 will show only paywall journal usage. TRJ3 will add information about open access usage to that. And TRJ4 will show title usage by publication year and so on. Depending on your resources, you may want to focus on collecting those base reports in order to have all the available data archived. But on the other hand, those reports contain so many metric types that they can be unwieldy and hard to parse by eye. So for example, my institution's TR report for IEEE in 2020 had over 40,000 rows, and some of the individual journals were represented by 50 or more rows of information. So in this case, some sort of relatively sophisticated approach using formulas, pivot tables, or other processing would be required to compile the desired data points. And finally, I'll note that some popular analysis tools actually lack the capability to work with the base reports. And this is currently the case with Alma Analytics, which we use here. This doesn't offer a way to differentiate between usage data for books, journals, and other data types that are included in the TR report. So if you're like us, it makes sense to collect them all. Moving on to non-standard reports. There will be cases where only one report format will be available, and these may or may not require some processing on your side to become usable. For example, if they record just server connection information or individual page views, a pivot table will likely be required to provide the summary numbers. Other providers may have interfaces where you can build your own usage report with a variety of options that you'll need to choose from. So in either case, you'll need to scrutinize the report structure to determine what you need to pay attention to. In my experience, identifying metrics that come as close as possible to what we look for in counter reports, for example, full text accesses and database record views, is a good bet. You'll also want to pay close attention to how the data is aggregated over time. Getting the numbers broken down by month corresponds to counter reporting practice. It permits greater flexibility in your analysis and makes it easier to detect anomalous transitory spikes in usage. So monthly basis is good. Once you've decided what information you're going to look for in the non-standard reports and how the report contents need to be processed to create the desired metric, make sure it's all clearly documented. So this slide at the bottom shows some example rows from a simple spreadsheet that we use in my library to track collection of the non-standard report data. So according to your system resources and personnel availability, you'll need to work out a practical schedule for collecting the usage reports that will allow you to have relatively complete information ready for a given resource and period of interest on request. At my current institution, by way of illustration, the frequency of report collection was a particularly vexing question when I started here. For some purposes, reports would be requested on an ad hoc basis, then used for a single project, and then saved in various project folders where they were difficult to find again. For other purposes, even though information covering the fiscal year was mainly what we needed for annual statistical reports and our cost per use analyses, there was still an effort to collect reports as frequently as was possible for our overstretched acquisition staff and the student workers who were helping them. These files were saved in a central location, but we ended up facing a bewildering array of reports that covered various, sometimes overlapping time periods for different resources, sometimes with a month or two missing. So the results were difficult to deal with when additional reporting requirements came up. The data we needed was hard to find, and when the relevant reports were available, it could be difficult to extract the information we wanted from files that had been generated for other purposes. In many cases, we just had to go back and retrieve the reports again from the provider. So it seemed pretty clear in that case that in order for the ongoing program of usage data collection to be successful, we had to have a regular workable schedule in place for retrieving the reports. And in order for that to be manageable, the reports needed to all cover the same standard period. Since it was evident that our main reporting requirements lined up with the fiscal year, it was decided that ongoing report collection would focus on ensuring we were able to report aggregate usage numbers for that period, which in our case was July to June. At the same time, we saw that any request for usage numbers that would come in the first part of the calendar year, January to June, would benefit from having more up-to-date information. So a second report gathering phase was added to collect reports covering the first half of the fiscal year, July to December. And this also gave us the capability of reporting on a calendar year when we wanted to. Electronic resources staff are now specifically tasked with completing the manual aspects of report gathering according to this biannual schedule. At the outset, we hadn't yet migrated to Alma and didn't have capabilities for automated report gathering using Sushi, but when this did become available, we set up monthly harvesting for as many providers as supported it, and this vastly reduced the labor required to stay up to date, to understate considerably. However, this did add another regular task to the workload of our staff, since we now need to monitor monthly sushi harvest for errors, ensure these are corrected, so that we can be confident that we'll have complete data for any given 6-month period. So throughout the presentation, I've been stressing the supreme importance of documentation to the process of setting up this usage data program. It's essential to have a clear picture not only of what reports you're collecting and how you get them, but also of how the report collection process is proceeding on an ongoing basis. This will help you keep the details straight regarding the various tasks involved in collecting your reports and provide clear guidance for any team members who may be contributing to the effort. Here at UNL, we found it useful to start with an overview document in a narrative style that describes the purpose of our usage data program and provides a rationale for decisions regarding scope and timing of report collection. This kind of document has been helpful reference when discussing how staff time might be allocated for data collection and provides useful guidance for further decision making. To document the actual process of report collection, we use spreadsheets that detail the type of reports collected for each provider, the date range covered, and the method we use to collect them. Currently, we use a number of shared workbooks for this purpose. We have one that tracks counter-compliant reports that are added to our ALMA system, either through sushi harvesting or periodic manual upload. These are organized by vendor and platform as represented in ALMA. And we also have a separate workbook to compile reports of ALMA's monthly sushi harvest jobs, where we can note any providers for which the harvest has failed for follow-up. Then we have another workbook documenting collection of non-standard reports, either through manual downloads or email requests. This part of the process is quite distinct from the management of counter reports, since ALMA doesn't support addition of non-standard usage data. We need to store those reports in a shared network location and record the appropriate usage numbers separately from our counter data. For the non-standard reports, we calculate the appropriate metric for the relevant 6 and 12-month periods and add that directly on our tracking spreadsheet. And we include an indicator for resource type, which makes it easy to sum up values for annual statistical reports. If you're using a system that allows you to add non-standard data for reporting alongside counter-compliant data, you'll likely take a different approach from that. However, it's always a good practice to keep a record of exactly how that non-standard data is being converted to something similar to the standard. And that is where I will end my discussion for today. There are obviously many additional considerations that will affect your engagement with your usage reports. But so much will really depend on the specific systems and methods that you use for storing and reporting on the data. Here's a schematic overview of the steps I've just discussed, covering those major areas of concern that are involved in getting comprehensive access to relevant e-resource usage reports and keeping them up to date, allowing you to be prepared to step up and provide the right data your libraries need for their queries. And with that, I'll say thank you, and we can move on to the discussion.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate you sharing that presentation. I think a lot of people are going to find it very useful. We do have some questions in the chat that I will, and in the Q&A, excuse me, that I will ask you. And if anyone else has a question for David, you can add it into the Q&A. Our first question is, any suggestions on best practices for setting up a shared email account, especially with two-factor authentication requirements, which require a single point of confirmation, such as a cell phone for text?
Right, so that was initially an issue with us when we were trying to move away from shared email accounts that were set up for completely different purposes and monitored by a different group of people than we're working with the usage reports. And what I found was that digging a little deeper with the provider in terms of using any email address you might be able to set up on your side, you'll generally be allowed to use that email address as a source of confirmation for changes and so on, rather for two-factor authentication rather than the phone number. And we have been able to substitute the email confirmation for the phone number in just about every case where it's been required.
All right, thank you. Next question. I've been told that vendors are unable to disaggregate users by function, i.e. faculty, students, etc., when the library uses ALMA. Is this true?
I would say yes, because they really if they are authenticating users according to, say, IP address, which would be the case many institutions, and say if you're using a proxy server, they don't have any way of on their side of seeing what user type it is, unless there is some other authentication step on the provider's site, uh, uh, a login of some sort where they have that record. And we do have some WRDS, Wharton, Research Data Services, do have individual user accounts, and they log in, and those are classified by user type. But generally, and for example, definitely in the case of counter reports, that differentiation is not going to be made. And I did bring that up. We faced questions about that here, and we have had to go into our proxy server and try and get some of that partial information, because on campus our users don't need to log into the proxy server, and try and get some sort of representative projection, I guess, of that type of division of usage by user type. So, but a short answer is that providers won't be able to do that unless they have that information about your users themselves.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Which reports do you use in Alma Analytics to extract your sushi data?
Oh, okay. Yeah, Sushi we use to actually automatically load the selected reports into Alma, the counter reports. And we used a variety ourselves here at UNL, and it's strictly our decision. And we use a range of those views of the base report currently. We started with that because they were more in line with the reports that had been provided in the previous standard or release of the standard, release 4. And we're differentiated in the way I mentioned in the presentation, some including open access, some including year of publication. And we've been focusing on those. But there is a recommendation from many experts to really go with the base reports. They used to be called master reports, but that terminology is being phased out for cultural reasons. And now they are just the reports rather than the views. And no, just because they contain all of the information that you would get from the various reports. And if you have a way of crunching those numbers and reporting on them, then you're getting the same information. And as I mentioned, however, Alma, with the analytics tool that it offers for reporting on the data, doesn't play well with those base reports. So
Thank you.
hopefully that'll be coming soon.
Next question. How are you going about monitoring the harvesting in Alma? Manually, using report, or something else? I see questions like this come up a lot.
I see these questions all the time. So what we do is it's a job that runs monthly in Alma. Here we go into the Alma specific terminology. And there it produces a report that lists all the various sushi accounts that you have set up in your Alma system, and indicates the outcome of each I guess harvest from each account. I'm trying to think of the right terminology. Whether it's failed, and then there's numerous error messages that could be returned, or whether it's been successful. We copy those and put them into a workbook and just go through them and sort of just filter to the the most recent month that we're looking at, and then look for the failures and address those. So we have these sort of workbooks with 12 sheets, one for each month, and we just monitor it that way. There are other ways to do that in Alma with reports generated, other reports generated within the system, but I found those kind of cumbersome and difficult to understand. So I take that kind of simplistic approach.
Thank you. There will be a presentation on monitoring sushi at the end of today's conference, so stay tuned.
I'll have to check that out.
Another question. Have your sushi reports from Alma's Sushi Harvester provided you accurate usage data that is identical to the data you would get from manually pulling the reports? I've heard anecdotally from other libraries that have compared Alma's sushi data to manually pulling the reports and found lots of data irregularities that led them to stop using Alma's data service. Interesting.
That is interesting. So I'm going to say that I have heard whispers about that sort of thing, and I have not done a systematic comparison of the usage reports coming from the providers to compare those with Alma, and that would be a project that I would set for myself at some point. I mean, it really, we have, Alma is what we have, and we are sort of stuck with it at the moment. But we are aware that there is processing of the data as it goes into the system. So there's always a possibility that something like that could happen. At the same time as that there's always a possibility that the vendor reports themselves have somehow can be corrupted in various times. So I don't have I guess, a good specific answer about that. It's always sort of hovering in the background, that question, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Some people are addressing that in the chat too. There's some good conversation there.
Okay, I'll check that out after.
Uh, Still have time for a couple more questions. What types of workbooks do you use to keep track of all that needs to be kept track of?
Just the standard Excel workbook that we share on our shared network drive, SharePoint, that we use. Obviously, Google Sheets could be used or anything like that. I am a big user of Excel and just the sort of basic spreadsheets for keeping track of things like that. So that's my short answer.
Thank you. Do you have a regular report collection schedule? Can you share the information?
Yeah, as I implied in the presentation, yeah, we collect twice a year. So when I started here, people were really trying to, they didn't have time to do it every month, so they sometimes would say, okay, we'll get the 2 months, and there were so many different reports hanging around for different periods, and sometimes they'd miss a month. Now we focus on twice a year. So our fiscal year is July to June. So there's a desire to have that reporting as well as for the annual statistics. So we start in July, trying to assemble all that information that we need to get outside of sushi, and then again January, February. We're working on that now to collect that second half of the calendar year, first half of the fiscal year, and we find that meets the needs. The only exception to that would be with the turnaway reports, access denials, and looking into trying to get that information out more quickly, especially with regard to ebooks, so we can get a sense if there are any titles that people are really trying to get at in huge numbers, so that we can sort of step in and purchase the book in question.
Okay, well, thank you for answering those questions, and thank you again for your presentation. That was really great. We enjoyed having you, and we will forward the unanswered questions to you, and we'll share those answers out to all attendees post-conference. So thanks again, David.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.